Amos walked into the classroom with mud on his boots. No one looked up, but he stared at the board like it might collapse. The door to room 3C clicked shut behind him. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Chairs creaked as students shifted. One kid hid a phone under the desk. Another shut their laptop because nothing useful happens this late anyway. Amos Walker picked the seat closest to the wall, near the emergency exit. Not because he was nervous, just because it gave him a better view. His rubber boots were still caked with reddish dirt. He'd been up since 4 a.m., feeding cattle and fixing the shredder belt. Now he was in Chicago, tagging along with his dad to get a hydraulic pump repaired. They passed the university on the way, saw a sign, "Open lecture today." His father grunted, "Go ahead, but don't push through the ones in white shirts." Up front, Professor Alden Whitmore was scrawling across the board like a man chasing ghosts. Lines and symbols stretched from one edge to the other. A jungle of arrows, loops, and half-erased terms. When he finished, he wiped his hands on his coat and turned. "Don't worry," he said with a half-smile. "None of you are expected to solve this. It's just for fun." Laughter rippled through the room. Heads bobbed like someone had opened a valve. Amos didn't laugh. He stared at a part of the board near the left side. Not because he understood the symbols, but because something about the shape looked off. Not wrong, just off. Like a water pipe bent too far at the joint. Professor Whitmore went on. "This one's what we call a legacy problem. Still hasn't been cracked after 50 years. Some tried, all failed. So relax. I'm not assigning it. Just a fun little brain teaser." A girl in the front whispered to her friend, "Fun? That looks like somebody lost their mind." Amos raised his hand. Slowly. Quietly. Not high. Just enough to be seen. Heads turned. The boy in the checkered shirt, faded jeans, and farm boots. Whitmore squinted. "You got a question, cowboy?" Amos stood. His voice was calm, rough from wind and dust. "I just think, if the early direction leans wrong, then the follow-up loop's gonna warp, even if the rest looks balanced." A few students chuckled. One guy turned and said, "Pretty sure wave functions don't run through irrigation ditches, bud." Even Whitmore gave a dry smile. "You familiar with second-order derivatives, son?" Amos paused. Then, "Not really, but if your pump tilts on the first line, the pressure never flows right, no matter how straight you lay the rest." Silence. Then more chuckles. Sarcastic nods. Whitmore gave a polite nod like he'd just been offered homemade soap at a science fair. "Well, thank you. Rustic interpretation." More laughter. Amos sat down. No flush in his cheeks. No words under his breath. He just opened a battered notebook and drew a spiral. Nothing fancy. Just a loop like the one carved into the mud when his cow stumbled by the East Trough. After class, Amos headed straight out. But someone followed him. Clara Whitmore, the professor's granddaughter, one of the few who hadn't laughed. "Wait up," she said. "Amos, right?" "Yeah." "You really think what you said? About the loop warping?" Amos nodded. "Don't know what it's called. But I saw it. Back home. One corner of the field slants weird, so the water always curls the same way, no matter how we set the ditch." Clara hesitated. She'd never heard anyone compare wave dynamics to cowfield runoff. That night, Amos got home just after dark. His mother had left a plate on the table. His dad sat outside on the porch, sipping from an old plastic cup. "How was the lesson?" he asked. They laughed. "'Cause you were wrong?" "No, 'Cause I said something different." His dad grunted. "Ground doesn't like boots that twist sideways, but if your step's right, forget the rest." Amos said nothing. Upstairs, he flicked on a flashlight and opened his notebook. He didn't write, just stared at the last page. The spiral. He tore it out, folded it twice, then again, and slipped it into the pocket of his shirt. Tomorrow, he'd leave it on the professor's desk. He didn't open a textbook. He tied a rope to a shovel and walked in circles until the ground told him what the equations couldn't. Saturday morning in Maple Ridge was cool and silent. Just the wind through corn stalks and the creak of the old well pump. Amos Walker stepped out of the barn with a length of rope and a broken shovel handle. He didn't say a word, just walked to the flat patch of earth behind the hay bales, where his father had leveled the soil last spring. He stuck the shovel handle upright in the ground, then tied the rope to it. From the kitchen window, his mother watched. She didn't ask. Amos did strange things sometimes, but they were never random. He walked out the rope in a slow spiral, step by step, letting the tension shape his arc. The rope tightened, loosened, shifted. At each turn, he scratched a mark in the dirt with his boot heel. The pattern grew, not perfect, but balanced. Wide on one side, tighter on the return, like something that was breathing. By midday, a shape had formed, a large, shallow spiral carved into the soil. Amos stood at the center, sweat beading on his forehead, then walked back along the lines he'd made, stopping at a spot where the curve kinked, not on purpose, but because the ground dipped. There. That was the place no formula he'd seen could explain. He crouched and ran his hand through the dirt. The bend wasn't mathematical. It was physical, caused by slope, pressure, the give of the soil itself. But in the equations Whitmore had shown, that kind of real-world shift didn't exist. Everything there assumed perfection. Out here, nothing was perfect. But everything was true. Later that afternoon, Clara Whitmore showed up. She'd said she might come. Amos didn't ask, but he wasn't surprised when her bike kicked up dust on the gravel path and she called out, "Hey!" He nodded once and gestured toward the spiral. Clara walked around it, eyes wide. "You made this?" He nodded again. "What is it?" "Model." "Of what?" "Of the thing I saw on the board, but real." She stepped carefully between the lines, following the spiral inward. "It's smoother than the diagram." "It only looks smooth now," Amos said. "I corrected it as I walked. The first few passes were off." She looked up. "You corrected it without erasing?" "Didn't need to. Ground remembers." They sat on a hay bale as the sun lowered. Clara flipped open her notebook. "You don't write formulas?" Amos shook his head. "Don't trust him." "Why not?" He took a moment. Then, "They don't wobble." She smiled. "Most people would say that's the point. That's the problem." She stared at the spiral again. "You know, in math, they teach us symmetry, optimization, minimal error. But this is error," Amos said. "It bends, but doesn't break. Like a fence post in wet ground. It moves, but still holds." Clara was quiet. Then she said, "Do you want me to help translate it?" He glanced at her. "Into math, I mean. Equations. So people like my grandfather will understand it." Amos looked down at his boots, scuffed and dusty, then back at the spiral in the dirt. "Maybe," he said, "but not yet. Let it breathe first." That night, he brought the spiral into the barn. Not the dirt, the idea. He built a model using sticks, bent wire, and twine. He tied each part loosely, letting them shift under slight pressure. Then he added small weights, washers, stones, and watched how the shape changed. The wobble he saw in the soil happened again. It wasn't math yet, but it was something. He scribbled in his notebook, "If symmetry resists truth, let it wobble." She tried to translate him into math, but the more she wrote, the more the paper resisted her. Clara sat at her desk, back straight, pencil sharp, notebook open. Her dorm room smelled like dry ink and instant coffee. On the wall, 3 math competition certificates framed neatly. On the desk, 1 spiral drawn in dirt. She'd traced it from the photo she took at Amos's farm, cleaned it up, added axis lines, numbered the turns. Now she stared at it. She tried to model the curve using polar coordinates. The formula worked, for a perfect spiral. But Amos's wasn't perfect. It wobbled, shifted slightly on each rotation. At first, she thought it was just irregular soil. Then she noticed the pattern within the wobble, like hesitation built into motion. She frowned. No standard function allowed for it without adding arbitrary exceptions. But Amos hadn't added anything. He just walked it. She tried again. Parametric modeling, Fourier decomposition, even curvature equations used in topological surfaces. Each method smoothed it too much, ironed out the parts Amos had left untouched, the things that made it feel alive. By the end of the night, her desk was a mess of printouts and red X's. At 2:17 a.m., she wrote in the margin of her notebook, "Math keeps trying to control it, but the spiral doesn't want to be controlled." The next day, Clara skipped her linear systems class and biked to the farm. Amos was feeding chickens. He looked up but didn't say anything. "I tried," Clara said. He gave a slow nod. "I ran it through everything I know. It fights back. The math tries to flatten it, but your spiral's got this rhythm." Amos set down the feed bucket. "It's not mine." Clara blinked. "What?" "It's not mine," he repeated. "I just followed where the rope wanted to go." She exhaled, frustrated. "I don't know how to prove something that doesn't want to stay still." Amos smiled, faintly. "Then maybe proving it isn't the point." They sat by the spiral again. Some of the lines had faded in the rain, but it still held shape. Clara stared at it like a code half-cracked. "You ever think math has too many rules?" she asked. Amos looked out at the horizon. "I think rules are just scared of things that don't return the same answer twice." Back in her room that night, Clara opened a blank page and tried something new. She didn't write equations. She wrote steps. Anchor 1 point. Let the motion lean. Trust the bend. Mark the moment it falters. Shift. Begin again. She titled it, "Walker Spiral, Unformalized." "The farm kid's back," someone muttered. And just like that, the laughter started. But this time, Amos brought a question they couldn't laugh off. The invitation came printed on thick paper. No envelope. Just folded once, slid under the barn door like a piece of mail too ashamed to enter properly. Open Seminar. Student Research Dialogue. Room 3C. Topic: Alternative Problem Framing in Rotational Systems. Guests welcome. All contributions informal. Faculty present. No one signed it. But Amos didn't need a name. He recognized the scent of a challenge. Daniel Walker didn't say much when Amos told him. Just cleaned grease from his hands with a rag and asked, "You want to go?" Amos shrugged. "Don't know. Might just watch." His father nodded. That's fair. But if you speak loud enough that even the folks not listening have to stop. That Monday, Amos came to campus early, still in his flannel shirt. Boots cleaned this time, though the soles still carried the memory of the field. He had a cardboard box under his arm, not a laptop, no USB drives, just wire, twine, and 2 wooden stakes. He walked into room 3C, nodded to Clara, and took a seat in the back. The room filled fast. Not just undergrads, this time grad students. 2 assistant professors. 1 man with gray hair who hadn't been there before, sitting stiff with a leather notebook. The door clicked shut. A teaching fellow stepped up to open the session. We're here to explore alternative models. Think of today not as a test, but a chance to stretch. If you've been working on a private theory, now's your moment. A pause, and then the whisper, "Isn't that the tractor boy?" Clara stiffened. Someone in the second row muttered, "He's got rope in that box?" A ripple of laughter, the kind that spreads from a single smirk, like oil on water. Amos stood up, box in hand. The room quieted, not in awe, in anticipation. He walked to the front, set the box on the desk, pulled out a coil of wire shaped like a spiral, not perfect, not flat, held together by 3 pegs and a knot of string. He placed it down, slowly, like a farmer laying out seed. "This isn't math yet," he said, "but it's thinking." Silence. He rotated the model slightly. This kind of spiral doesn't stay steady. It shifts every turn. Not randomly, but because of how it carries its past. He looked up. When we try to graph it, we fix it. But in the field, nothing stays fixed. It breathes. This was drawn with a walking step and a rope. A student in the back coughed. "So, it's a dirt doodle?" Snickers. Amos didn't react. He picked up a marker and drew on the board, a single curve, with breaks in it. Dots along the way. Then arrows showing how each bend leaned away from the expected path. "Each point bends," he said. "But the spiral still returns. Not by force, by memory." A hand shot up. Julian Park. "Are you suggesting this model can solve known equations?" Amos shook his head. "No. I'm suggesting some equations are afraid of this." Julian nodded once. But then another voice spoke up. Sharper. Familiar. Trevor Langford. Polished. Blazer perfect. Expression confident. "I have a question," Trevor said, standing. "If this model is so meaningful, where's the data?" He crossed his arms. "Where's the analysis? The regression? The error rate? You built a spiral with your feet. We build proofs with our minds." Murmurs of agreement. The academic scent of blood. Amos looked at him. Calm. "You ever chase a cow through mud, Trevor?" The room blinked. "What?" "You ever feel how a hoof bends the ground under pressure? How it curls back, not forward?" Trevor scoffed. "We're in a math room, not a barn." Amos turned back to the board. "And that's why your equations collapse when the world leans sideways." The moderator cleared his throat. "Let's stay civil. Maybe Amos can share an application?" Clara raised her hand. "Actually, I ran a simulation last night." All eyes turned. She stepped forward, holding printed sheets. "I used Amos's spiral pattern as a dynamic input into a rotational feedback model. It didn't solve the system, but it stabilized it." She laid the page down. Here. Without the spiral, the model crashed after iteration 18. With it, it breathed. She looked at Trevor. You call that dirt, but maybe your math just isn't grounded enough. Now the room was silent. Not polite silence. Calculating. Even Trevor looked unsure. And then the gray-haired man spoke. I'd like to see this model. Physically. Amos turned. The man stood. Dr. Emmett Dale, Systems Theory. I've written 3 papers on failure states in bounded spirals. None of them explain this. He walked forward, picked up the spiral, ran a hand along its wire frame. This is ugly, he said. Imprecise. Undocumented. He looked up. And entirely worth pursuing. After the session, Amos didn't stay for compliments. He packed the box. Clara walked beside him. You okay? She asked. He nodded. Wasn't there to win. You think you made a dent? Amos stopped, looked back at the door. I didn't hit the wall. I just made it echo. That night, back on the farm, his dad asked, You talk? Amos nodded. Did they listen? A few. His dad grunted. That's more than most. Then he handed Amos something. It was a book. Old, covered in dust. Inside, not words, just pages filled with lines, arcs, shapes. What is this? Amos asked. His dad smiled. Your grandfather's notes. He couldn't read much, but he thought in curves, too. Amos held the book. Pages yellowed with time, and for the first time, he didn't feel like he was starting something. He felt like he was continuing it. It wasn't the spiral that scared them. It was the question inside it. What if the equation everyone trusted leaned the wrong way from the start? 3 days passed. Amos stayed on the farm, didn't check his phone, didn't ask Clara for updates. He stacked hay, fixed a cracked water pipe, built a new gate hinge for the chicken pen using scrap metal and a welding torch borrowed from the neighbor. It wasn't avoidance. It was rhythm. Out here, you didn't rush answers. You worked, and let the questions catch up if they wanted to. But in room 4F of the Applied Systems Lab, 2 professors were not waiting. Dr. Emmett Dale, the gray-haired systems theorist who had touched Amos's wire spiral with more reverence than most showed peer-reviewed journals, was staring at a chalkboard covered in loops. Next to him stood Dr. Brenna Klein, a fractal analyst with a sharp tongue and sharper pencil. She had re-sketched Amos's spiral 5 times, each version more perfect than the last, and each time, something went wrong. The sequence collapses on turn 4, she muttered. Dr. Dale paced. I know. Every time we try to symmetrize it, the pattern dies. Klein frowned. Then why is it stable when he does it in wire and dirt? Dale stared at the board. Because he's not solving it, he said slowly. He's listening to it. They tried applying the spiral's wobble as a correction to the core loop of a foundational equation used in energy containment fields, an equation assumed stable for over 20 years. The math spat it out, then hesitated, then accepted it. Klein blinked. That's not possible. Dale leaned closer to the screen. Check the initial condition assumptions. She did, then froze. Oh, God. The base equation, the one taught to every grad student in system dynamics, assumed directional equilibrium from 0. But if you inserted Amos's spiral dynamics, that 0 shifted slightly, not randomly, patterned, as if the system had memory. Do you know what this means? Klein whispered. Dale didn't answer at first. Then, it means we've been solving the wrong frame for 20 years. Elsewhere, in a quiet study room, Clara read the same message on her phone 4 times. He broke it. With dirt and rope. Meet tomorrow. Confidential. Dr. Dale. She closed the screen, sat still, then opened her notebook. At the top of a blank page, she wrote, "What if the system never needed fixing? Just realignment." The next morning, Amos walked into the lab wearing his usual flannel and boots. Klein barely looked up. She was hunched over a tablet, muttering to herself. Dr. Dale gestured him over. "We need to show you something." Amos stood beside the screen. It displayed a rotating shape, faint pulses tracing a path that wobbled, exactly like his spiral. "This," Dale said, "is your pattern, modeled digitally. Not as a formula, but as an influence." Amos nodded once. "That's what it feels like." "Feels like?" "Like pressure on a gate. Not enough to break it. Just enough to remind it it's crooked." Klein snorted. "He speaks in metaphors. Great." Dale ignored her. "We applied your spiral influence to one of the oldest stability equations we have." Amos looked at the projection again. "Did it break?" "No," Dale said. "It bent. Then held." Klein finally looked up. "Let's be clear," she said, walking over. "Your dirt drawing didn't solve anything, but it did something no one else dared." Amos tilted his head. "What's that?" She pointed to the board. "It tilted the base." He blinked. "The what?" Klein's voice dropped slightly. "There's a set of equations, ones we build everything on. Controls, containment, prediction models. Every assumption comes from the idea that systems begin in balance." She stepped closer. "But your spiral says, what if balance was never the beginning?" The room went silent. Amos crossed his arms. "Is that a problem?" Klein hesitated. "For people who built careers on balance, yeah, it's a problem." Later that day, word started to spread, not on forums or emails, but in whispers. The spiral equation had tilted a foundation. Some grad students called it exciting. Others called it dangerous. One department head privately said, "Shut it down before the donors see." That night, Clara visited Amos at the farm. They sat on the porch. No words for a while. Then she said, "You broke something." "I didn't mean to." "I know." She passed him a folder. Inside were diagrams, charts, and a letter, stamped preliminary research review, internal eyes only. "It's moving faster than we thought," she said. "Some of them are panicking." Amos flipped through the pages, stopped at a graph. "Is this what they were hiding?" Clara nodded. They knew, years ago. Some edge case models collapsed when tilted even slightly off axis. They patched it, called it margin of error. She looked away. "But your spiral doesn't collapse. It dances. It leans and holds. And that scares them." Amos looked out across the field. "Where I'm from, when the barn leans, you either fix it or build a new frame." Clara watched him. "And what are you gonna do?" He closed the folder. "Build." "They won't disprove you," the professor said. "They'll bury the question." It was Clara who made the call. "Amos, can you meet me at the library? 3rd floor, history wing, room 3F. She didn't sound like herself. No excitement, no awe, just caution. When Amos arrived, she was already inside the small archival reading room, surrounded by folders, yellowed printouts, and a legal pad filled with her neat, looping handwriting. "What is this?" he asked. She slid a folder across the table. It was labeled Lever, Lateral Equilibrium Vector Reanalysis. It was a project run quietly in the late 90s. I found it mentioned in a footnote on an old control theory paper. That led me to Professor Lyle. Amos raised an eyebrow. "He's the guy who taught Dale, right?" "Yes, retired now, but I wrote to him. He answered." She slid a printed email across the table. "Clara, I was surprised anyone still cares about Lever." It wasn't suppressed so much as neglected into silence. If your student is seeing something, tell him to be careful. The math is real. The consequences, too. Amos read it twice. "He's not warning us about being wrong," Amos said. "He's warning us about being right." Clara nodded. "Exactly." They didn't go into any hidden lab, no underground facility. What they found was in a dusty cardboard box Clara borrowed from the university archives. Lever had been a side project, never formally published, never officially shut down. Just quietly. Set aside. Inside the box were printouts of simulations, early graph theory models, and 2 handwritten notes from Lyle himself. The system resists flattening. Stability is not neutrality. It's memory repeating itself. Amos leaned back in his chair. He was seeing the same thing, just didn't have a spiral to walk. Clara sighed. He tried. The models were ahead of their time. He told me over the phone they ran one public test, and it failed on purpose. Someone adjusted the input to break the system. Why? Because if it had worked, it would have meant rethinking every stability assumption in system design, and no one wanted that in 1999. They worked through the documents for hours. What became clear was this: the Lever project had stumbled onto the same insight Amos had walked into with his rope and dirt. That balance was never truly static. It bent, leaned, held memory. But because they couldn't frame it without threatening foundational models, the project was discredited quietly and forgotten. Lyle was one of the most promising theorists in his day, Clara said. Then suddenly, after Lever, he stopped publishing. He started teaching entry-level classes until retirement. Amos understood. You don't always get silenced by shouting. Sometimes you just get reassigned. That night, Clara sent an encrypted folder to Amos. Inside, scanned notes from Lyle, a few simulation files, and a single audio recording. In the clip, Lyle's voice was quiet, older. You have to decide, Mr. Walker, whether the spiral you carry is something to prove or something to live. Because if you try to win with it, you'll lose. But if you let it live where others won't look, it might outlast them all. Amos didn't reply. He walked outside, looked at the spiral still faint in the dirt behind the barn. The rain had nearly erased it, but the memory was there. And he whispered, to no one in particular, let it live. They had called it unstable. But what if it was simply unafraid of balance? The next morning, Amos parked his truck beside the engineering annex, not far from the compost shed where students dumped their failed hydroponic experiments. He wasn't dressed for class. No notebook, no laptop, just the satchel Clara had handed him, packed with scans of Lever's models, Lyle's notes, and a folder of Amos's spiral diagrams. Inside, room E201 was mostly used for independent study or late-night grad meetings. Clara had reserved it under a fake seminar name, Nonlinear Applications in Transitional Equilibria. No one questioned it. We have 6 days, she said, spreading documents across the long metal table. Then this room gets reassigned. We run the model, record everything, and see if it still fights back. Amos ran his finger across the edge of Lyle's hand-drawn spiral. It wasn't perfect, but it was intentional. It bent and leaned as if obeying something memory-shaped, not logic-shaped. "You're sure this is the latest version?" he asked. Clara nodded. From Lyell's second round of tests, just before he was told to abandon it. I checked the time codes on his simulation logs. They weren't errors, they were reactions. The first 3 days were a mess. The model ran, but nothing held. They tried loading Lyell's code into modern simulation platforms, but the software buckled. Amos had to redraw the vectors by hand. Clara rewrote the initial conditions in simpler language just so the compiler wouldn't crash. They brought in old projectors from the media lab, overlaying Amos's spiral against the digital output. Day 4, something shifted. Clara was testing the third iteration of Lever's core loop, the one that introduced a rhythmic delay every fourth cycle. The screen displayed a crude spiral, but then as the loop hit the delay node, the form bent, not erratically but deliberately. It held a wobble, then recovered. "Did you see that?" she said. Amos didn't speak. He walked up to the board, picked up a piece of chalk, and traced what had just appeared on screen. Not a perfect arc, but a leaning one. The kind you'd only get if the system expected imbalance. He whispered, almost to himself, "It's not trying to return to baseline. It's trying to remember where it leaned last time." That night, Clara stayed behind to render the results into a format she could store offline. Amos walked to the greenhouse shed behind the annex. He needed space to think. He found a piece of discarded irrigation hose, wrapped it in a coil, and unspooled it slowly across the dirt floor. One loop, then another, each leaning slightly. The curve bent left, then countered right. No straight lines, no symmetry. And yet the whole thing felt balanced. It wasn't chaos. It was a memory that refused to be symmetrical. He took a photo and texted it to Clara. "Spiral stable, but not centered." She replied immediately. "Neither are we." Day 5. They added external disturbance to the model. Clara simulated a push, a delayed force input that would normally destabilize a feedback system. But the lever simulation didn't collapse. It bent, held the memory of the disturbance, and carried it forward. Not resistance. Adaptation. Amos stared at the logs. The energy distribution graph wasn't evening out like a normal damping response. It was repeating the bend, almost like a phrase in music. Not mechanical, but expressive. Clara whispered, "Is this what Lyell meant by memory?" Amos nodded. "It doesn't resist correction. It just refuses to forget." They saved the file, printed the data, built overlays. By the end of the 5th day, they had one folder labeled Demonstration Sequence. Amos looked at Clara. "We show this to Dale?" She hesitated. "We show it to the one person he listens to." Professor Marlin Judd was the current chair of Applied Systems, a quiet man, mid-60s, with a calm voice and a reputation for brutal peer reviews. He agreed to meet after Clara sent him a draft of their abstract. They presented the spiral. Amos spoke first. "We're not saying the current stability models are wrong, just incomplete. They treat imbalance as failure. But what if imbalance is how systems remember stress?" Judd said nothing. Clara showed the 4th cycle delay response. "This shouldn't happen," she said. "The model should correct, but instead it adapts, not just once, repeatedly, in a way that mirrors spiral motion." Judd leaned forward. His eyes were hard to read. "This would invalidate 3 decades of feedback control assumption," he said. "Only if you treat the spiral as threat," Amos said. There was a long silence. Then Judd asked, Did Lyle give you this? Clara nodded. He left it behind. We picked it up. Judd stood, walked to the board, stared at the spiral. You'll be invited to present this, but not where you think. That night, Clara got a message. Not from the university. Not from Judd. From mthorne@policyreach.org. Subject: Inquiry on Lever and Equilibrium Memory. Ms. Nguyen, I was intrigued by your draft paper on memory-based adaptation in spiral form systems. This could have wide applications in urban stress modeling and economic forecasting. Let's discuss. Informally. Best, Marcus Thorne. Clara forwarded the message to Amos with one line. It's starting. Back at the barn, Amos sat under the porch light, spiral diagram on his lap, the wind lifting the corners of the page. The system didn't flatten, not because it was defiant, but because it had learned not to. And maybe that was the point. They couldn't disprove the spiral, so they questioned the boy who drew it. The invitation came 3 days later. It wasn't to a conference. It wasn't even labeled as academic. It was a closed-door review and recommendations forum, hosted by a coalition of public policy consultants, infrastructure strategists, and private tech foundations. The location? A converted boardroom on the 14th floor of the State Science Initiative building in Lincoln. This isn't a presentation, Clara whispered as they stepped off the elevator. It's an inquisition. Amos didn't reply. He had the spiral folded in his back pocket, drawn in charcoal, a new version, tilted more than usual. Inside, they were seated at a wide glass table. Half the faces wore suits. The other half had laptops already open. At the far end sat Marcus Thorne. Thank you for coming, he said, without looking up. There was no round of applause, no introduction, just a click as someone started a screen share. Amos recognized their model instantly. Thorne cleared his throat. We've reviewed the lever sequence. Fascinating, provocative, but also problematic. He clicked again. A new slide. Implications for systemic design, disruption or deviation. If adopted, Thorne continued, your spiral-centric logic challenges traditional control feedback loops used in everything from financial modeling to autonomous vehicle correction. He looked directly at Amos. So I must ask, what makes you qualified to propose this? Amos stared at him, then at Clara, then back. I never proposed it, he said. I just saw it. A man in a tan blazer leaned forward. You claim the system remembers stress. Can you mathematically define what that memory looks like across iterations? I can show it, Amos said. But can you formalize it? Another voice cut in. A woman with a sharp bob haircut. If this were submitted to peer review, could it survive without you drawing circles in the dirt? Clara started to respond, but Amos raised a hand. That's the point, he said. The spiral doesn't survive by being explained. It survives by being repeated. Silence. Then laughter. But not everyone was laughing. After the meeting, Thorne pulled Clara aside. He's good. But this won't work unless someone translates him. Translate? She asked. This isn't about truth. It's about packaging. Clara stepped back. You want to use him? Thorne shook his head. No, I want to weaponize him, but not unless you build the language around the idea. That night, Clara sat alone in the dorm library, the spiral projected on the wall beside her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't scared. She was calculating. What does it mean to protect something? Not by hiding it, but by placing it in a language they can't steal. She began drafting a paper. Not one about Amos. One that sounded like systems theory. One that looked like math, one that used the spiral as a footnote. And in the appendix, a note. This framework was inspired by an observed nonlinearity in equilibrium response drawn from unstructured pattern recall. Attribution withheld by request. Meanwhile, Amos returned to the farm. He didn't tell his father about the meeting. He just walked to the back lot, dug a fresh spiral in the soil. This one had 4 loops. The final curve tilted more than the others. He let it lean. He stood in the center, alone, listening. Not to data, not to logic, but to rhythm. 2 weeks later, Clara received a response from a small journal known for experimental systems modeling. Her paper was accepted. They asked if she'd like to present at their fall symposium. She declined, but she forwarded the email to Amos with one line. "It's in." Quietly, but it's in. Later that night, Clara added one more line to her notebook. "Some spirals don't need stages, just soil." They buried it in silence, so he planted it in the ground. The invitation to return to campus came quietly, and Amos declined it even more quietly. No statement, no refusal. Just silence. He had work to do. That spring, the rains came early. The topsoil on the Walker farm darkened with moisture and memory. Amos spent 3 mornings walking the western field, dragging a length of rope behind him, not in lines, in arcs, in bends, in loops, spirals that twisted not toward the sky, but inward, down into the very logic of the land. His father watched from the porch. "You gonna plant something or just draw shapes in the dirt all season?" Amos looked up, grinned. "Same thing, maybe." Clara didn't write for 2 months. Then one envelope arrived, hand-addressed. Inside was a photograph, not digital, printed, slightly curled at the corners. It showed one of Amos's spirals in the field, but overgrown now with shoots of green, tiny sprigs that had followed the curves. The caption in her handwriting, "You were right. Things do remember where they leaned." She had been accepted to a dual-track PhD program in systems theory and agricultural modeling, on the strength of the spiral paper. But she had declined all major offers. She chose a small research station in Vermont, where no one cared about packaging, only pattern. She ended the note with, "You changed the math, but maybe more than that, you changed the way it listens." By midsummer, 3 other journals had cited Clara's work. None named Amos. None needed to, because the spiral had become something else. A phrase in design circles, a whisper in ecological planning, a metaphor in economic forecasting, spiral memory, the idea that systems remember their stress not in collapse, but in curvature. No one had disproved it, but no one fully claimed it either. It lived in the soil, and that was enough. One day in August, a car pulled into the Walker driveway. Clara stepped out, sun hat in hand, hair longer now. Amos looked up from the fence post he was hammering. "Didn't expect you till September." The data didn't wait. Neither did I. They walked the length of the field in silence. Around them, the crop had taken the shape of nothing textbook. Ridges leaned into curves. Trenches spiraled outward. Birds flew lower here, tracing the terrain like sheet music. She finally said, "You know they'll rewrite it. Remove the curves, replace them with efficient squares." "Probably," Amos said, "but not this one." He bent down, ran his hand along a line of clover growing at a steady inward bend. "It remembers." Back in town, a young teacher at the vocational school invited Amos to speak. Not at the main high school, but in the mechanics wing. 12 students, 10 of them half listening, 2 of them fully asleep. He didn't bring a PowerPoint. He brought a coil of rope, unfurled it on the floor. Most systems don't break in one big moment, he told them. They bend first, then they pretend they're fine. Then they forget how they bent in the first place. A student raised his hand. So what's the fix? Amos smiled. Sometimes it's not about fixing. It's about remembering. Another student laughed. You teaching therapy or engineering? Both, Amos said. That winter, someone started a thread on a systems design forum. Whatever happened to the spiral logic thing from that lever theory revival? Replies ranged from, dead concept, no citations lately. Interesting metaphor, not scalable. Still think that farm kid was on to something. No consensus. But someone linked a photo, the spiral in clover. No caption. Just, it still grows like this. Amos never sought credit. What he sought was resonance. The sense that somewhere, something he had seen in the shape of rain and rope and rhythm had entered a different kind of soil. One made of minds. Years later, an article in a minor journal included this line. We believe some forms of spiral memory could be inherent to adaptive rural economies. While difficult to model, such responses suggest a lived equilibrium rather than a linear recovery. The author didn't cite Clara, the author didn't cite Lever, but Amos read it and smiled. The last spiral he drew was behind the barn. 5 loops, wide at the mouth, tighter toward the center. No seed planted, no crop intended. Just dust, just shape, just memory. And as the sun fell below the tree line, Amos walked it slowly, step by step. The wind moved behind him, and nothing broke. Everything leaned and held. Some people aren't born to take the stage. They're born to plant things in fields no one notices. Amos never stood beneath applause. He didn't break records or collect awards, but he left behind something more enduring, a quiet spiral traced in the soil and in the thinking of those still enough to see it. This story isn't about genius, it's about stillness, about ideas that don't need microphones, just someone who listens, about the children labeled too simple, when in truth they were just following curves the world hasn't yet learned how to measure. If you've ever felt like you didn't fit into what others called correct, if you've ever carried something beautiful inside without knowing how to explain it, then please remember this. Not every truth needs to be shouted. Some truths only ask to be lived. Thank you for walking this path with me. And if there's a spiral inside your heart, don't flatten it to fit the world. Let it lean. Let it live. The author.